What was a king in the 7th century? Did they govern? Did they tax? Theirs was an international aristocracy. And among their most powerful symbols was the ship. Archaeology, like music, is a common language, the language of things. Because I don't speak Norwegian, Norway seems foreign to me until I visit its monuments. Now, I could be in Suffolk or Sweden or almost anywhere in the pagan north of the Dark Ages, when men spoke across boundaries using not words, but mounds, and gold, and boats.
Here at Bodø in Vestfold, a big new project is just beginning. Using excavation and remote sensing, Norwegian scholars are hoping to throw light on the social origins of their country, just as we are at Sutton Hoo. There's no doubt that Norway and England had lots in common in the 6th century. Both were pagan, competitive, fond of wealth, fond of boats. They were sea peoples. And they buried their richer dead in burial mounds, and sometimes buried a ship in the mounds too. Also, in both lands, in the 7th century, more stable kingdoms were beginning to be formed. Kingdoms like East Anglia in England and Vestfold in Norway. But the destinies of these kingdoms was to be very different. The English became Christians. The Norwegians became Vikings.
Before the days of the car and the motorway, the sea was easier to cross than the land. It was a highway where peoples met and contested power. The Vikings were great seafarers, but so were the Anglo-Saxons before them. And with this ship, we get our first glimpse of the long love affair between the English and the sea, and between the sea and English royalty. Princess Mary Louise, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, visits the Sutton Hoo excavations in 1939. Redwald's regalia, exquisite pieces of gold and garnet jewellery, lie in the hot sun of that last pre-war summer. But the biggest surprise, then as now, was the ship, first discovered by Suffolk archaeologist Basil Brown. Not just another find, but a whole piece of architecture to be painstakingly unveiled. And even more surprising was its great size, over 27 metres or 90 foot long. Not only larger than any Viking ship known, but 200 years earlier. The triumph of the 1939 excavations was that it conjured this ship out of nothing more than patterns in the sand. The curve of the ribs, the dark lumps of the ship's rivets which held the strakes of the hull together. And there, on the gunwale, a stain shaped like a wave or a thorn, the wooden thole against which an oar was pulled.
The earliest English ships are a shadowy lot, to say the least. We have drawings of timbers and traces in the ground, and even some reconstructions. but it's still hard to visualise a 1,000-year-old rowing boat. This is probably as near as we can get at present to seeing what the Sutton Hoo ship would have looked like. It's a replica of a 7th century boat found at Kvalsund here in western Norway. She's about 18 metres long and would have been propelled by 20 oarsmen who pulled the oars against these wooden tholes fastened to the gunwale by iron spikes. For this type of vessel, it could make 3 knots in the sea easily, and a journey from Norway to Denmark in a day, no problem.
The design of this ship seems both natural and timeless. The robust wooden thole to take the energy of the oars, the frame lashed with withies to the hull. But these things too were once innovations.
The Anglo-Saxons in their day seem to have been excellent seamen. Sidonius, a 5th century Roman gentleman living in Gaul, complained that they had scant respect for the sea and that they thought shipwreck was a bit of a joke. He was referring to the Saxons' practice of beaching their craft through the surf wherever they felt like it, thus avoiding Roman customs and terrifying old gentlemen.
Were Saxon pirates the Vikings of their day? In this, as in everything, they are so elusive. Here in western Norway is still a land of boats. They've kept the tradition of clinker building and rowing and building fine replicas. During the Second World War, Norwegian villagers left these shores in much smaller boats than this and rowed to Scotland, taking their goods and chattels with them. Here the fjord is the way in, and visitors first show on its waters whether they come in peace or war. In East Anglia's muddy, cluttered estuaries, with their marinas and built-up quaysides, the older world is now well buried. But we can't doubt that Anglo-Saxon people were boat people. And the hunt starts here, at Woodbridge, where 1,300 years ago the Sutton Hoo burial ship was dragged out of the water. This is the start of an excavation. The excavation of a burial mound with, we hope, a ship in it. The keynote of the new campaign is respect for the monument and scientific caution. Its first 3 years were dedicated to reconnaissance and planning.
This period of preparation was very necessary. We had to answer that well-known archaeological question, where do I dig? Well, now we think we know the answer. We've laid out, with white lines, a number of sectors containing some 5 Anglo-Saxon burial mounds. Their excavation, we believe, will add considerably to our knowledge of English history. Mound 2, we think, contains a ship, perhaps a ship as long and as great as that found beneath Mound 1. We're on the threshold of a very exciting and important excavation. Take a last look at Sutton Hoo. It's never going to look like this again, and nor will its story ever be quite the same.
Say cheese.
A little ceremony to wish us on our way. A burial mound is a ritual monument like a church, but less familiar in meaning and more difficult to unravel. The first thing you need is muscles.
Tea break in the morning.
We have 700 tons of earth to shift, but not by mechanical excavation. Every shovelful must be seen and inspected by a practiced eye. Our full-time workforce is helped by the County Council's Manpower Services Scheme, students from sixth forms and from universities the world over, and by friends and relations and other professional men and women taking a holiday from the 20th century. The task is formidable. To take the mound apart, layer by layer, stain by stain, and then reassemble it on paper. That means more than cutting slices through it. It means mapping it in plan and elevation at the same time. This technique has not been applied to a burial mound before and is somewhat controversial. Is it really possible to record the innards of this enormous, opaque heap of sand in 3 dimensions?
Well, that's certainly the intention, that we can keep the vertical sections intact and continuous from the top of the excavation to the bottom. Even though we shall never see them standing in one go, we can at least join all the pieces together. And then a continuous series of plans as we peel the barrow apart should help us, hopefully, to put the whole thing together again at the end.
Yeah.
Each segment or quadrant is lowered in turn, 10 to 20 centimetres at a time, leaving a little vertical cliff in section at its edge, and a smooth, convex surface to be examined in plan by the diggers.
Straight underneath the turf, we come to the dark brown surface of the barrow. You can see the edge beautifully at the end there, marked by the little white labels. And here at the top, something looking suspiciously like a grave, covered with a small cairn of stones. Cutting over here, a weapons pit, probably from the Second World War. And it's at this level, too, that we've been finding these ship rivets, corroded iron used to hold the planking of a vessel together. A vessel which, therefore, must have stretched the whole length of this barrow to the west end, where we now are.
At this stage, we still expected a ship in situ, but not, of course, a ship of solid wood. Sutton Hoo has its own special way of making things into ghosts. These are British Museum excavations from 20 years ago, when Anglo-Saxon graves and bodies were found.
This isn't a coffin, this is a wooden box from a greengrocer, which in 1970 was placed over the legs of an Anglo-Saxon skeleton, which had survived at that time. And look what's happened to the box. Now, the consistency of cheese. The soil at Sutton Hoo is very acidic, and that's what it does to organic materials.
Look sideways at a piece of earth, even Sutton Hoo earth, and you can see changes in colour and texture of the greatest subtlety. That is why drawing a soil sequence is always important on soft sites. To make an accurate record of these changes, you need an agreed set of colour codes, a good pair of eyes, and the patience of Cathy Royal.
How's it going, Kath?
I've just about finished this one now. There's one or two interesting things in this section. Can you see where that very thin dark stripe is? Just underneath the orange bit? Yeah, that's right. Well, I've got that here. And I think there's a few more small dark things like that too. And I think they might be the remains of rotted turfs. So it's either post-constructional disturbance, turfs from the Basil Brown excavation, or it might be the actual barrow construction, because that's what we saw in plan in one of the other areas.
Looks mighty mixed to me. The whole thing looks incredibly mixed up. It's very nice, that. I mean, I can work with that.
Good.
And we've got a lot of bracken roots here too.
Yes, well, I've drawn those on too, just to show, where some areas are more disturbed than others.
Using that special, which colour?
Chocolate.
Chocolate bracken,
Yeah.
very nice.
The greatest enemy we have in this kind of work is gnawing impatience. You feel you want to dispense with all this tickling and grooming and get to the bottom of things. But only by brushing and cleaning can you give all the strata their chance to speak. Even if they say nothing, you owe them that. The worst thing the future can say of us is not, they didn't understand, but they never looked. The bare mound is being turned into 500 soil descriptions and some 5,000 colour photographs. Our way of seeing what the Saxons did. And now the mound is dismantled, taken apart in reverse order to its construction, Shovel by shovel, barrow by barrow, we unbuild the Saxon monument. The walkways, crisscrossing like pastry strips on a pie, are the baulks of soil which separate each dissected quadrant of the inner mound.
Between the baulks, we've taken the soil away from the level at horizon 1, where we can see very little, to horizon 2, where we can see a great many interesting features starting to appear. The surface of the mound itself is visible, covered in black and tan blotches of its makeup. And around the mound, for the very first time, we can see this light grey strip. It looks rather like a track, but it is in fact the quarry ditch of the mound. Now we shall start to empty that ditch and see what it really looks like.
Finding the quarry ditch is finding the key to the original size of our mound. The Saxons dug a ring ditch and heaped up the earth from it in the centre. A ditch now full of silt washed off the monument by 1,000 years of rain. Shovelling out this silt gives us back the geometry of the ditch. A wide, shallow, circular scoop first cut into an Anglo-Saxon ploughed field. "10,000 wheelbarrow loads or 3,000 man-hours would be needed to build a mound 2. Each load no doubt getting heavier and each journey longer to the top of the heap. The mound builder's purpose was not simply to build a mound, but to bury a ship. We knew its remains would lie somewhere within the earth we were taking away, but something was clearly wrong. The rivets were jumping up everywhere, and that was the problem. These rivets were certainly from a ship, but their pattern was wild and random, not in rows as they should be, but tipped and scattered as though somebody had picked up our ship and shaken it. We now know 2 things for certain about this mound: that Basil Brown cut a trench through it in 1938, and that it was then already robbed. Robbers took much of the treasure and must have disturbed the ship too. Every day of our own excavations helps us to distinguish these events more clearly. Sieving turns up scraps of precious metal from the robbing and prehistoric flint and pottery from the mound. You understand ancient earthworks better by turning them into work yourself. There's obviously more to building a burial mound than making a spoil heap. Look at ours. Mound building was more organised, more structured. But we still don't know what that structure was, or what the mound looked like when first built. But the clues are coming. Here, in the intimate record, gradually growing under the pencil of the illustrator. It's a pencil on which much depends. When the mound has gone, only these drawings will remain. At my feet, the natural sand and gravel, and on top of that, a dark band, which is the ancient soil. It was on this old ground surface that the Anglo-Saxons trod, and into it they cut their graves. On top of it, they raised their mounds. The mound behind me is being sliced into horizons so that we can see its structure, the dark grey of the turf and the bright orange of the sand and gravel. It must have taken an awful lot of people, and one can imagine some of them manhandling great pieces of turf, others shoveling sand and gravel into carts and into baskets, and then trudging up the hill, throwing down the earth, and trudging down again to get another load, while the mound rose steadily against the skyline. That fine vision is somewhat at odds with the shape we've now got when viewed from up here. Why is the mound so broad and the quarry ditch so narrow? and cut so straight. The edge of the mound doesn't look right. Was it their mistake or ours? It was ours.
This level, all the way along the bottom of the mound, we have this ripple of small pebbles. First we thought that they were peeking out from the upcast from the ship trench. Then we thought they were just rolled down as people had dumped soil on the top. Now I think they're in a ditch. These here are going down into a cut, down into the ditch we had before. So the edge of the mound is now here.
No harm done. The rest of the real ditch fill comes out and all is made clear. The mound was built in 2 stages. The first of them was 25 metres in diameter and at least 3 metres high. That's a large monument on the 7th century skyline. But where are its people?
This little ditch is a precious asset. There's not much to look at. In fact, there's not very much of it left. 1 inch higher and we didn't see it. 2 inches lower down and we would have troweled it away. But what it means is that the grave in which Mark is working was originally surrounded by a ditch, and on top of that grave was a little mound, a mini mound, and it provides the missing link between the unfurnished graves of the lower orders and the great earthworks of kings. So in this grave we expect to find a middle-ranking person, a member of a family, perhaps with the start of pretensions to status. So this little scoop in the earth is a social comment.
That, it turned out, was no middle-ranking warrior, but a child of high status. On the south side of Mound 2, there were several other graves. None had grave goods, and the bodies were turned to dark sand. Why did these people go off to the next world without any possessions? The contrast was to become sharper still. There were some unfortunates, not laid peaceably in the grave, but folded and distorted as though killed and dumped. Only nobles, slaves and sacrifices, it seems, get into this part of the Sutton Hoo cemetery. And only those buried beneath the mounds have grave goods at all. Extracted from Mound 2's spoil mountain comes a fragment of its former riches. A fragment all the more precious because now so rare. All the finds from Sutton Hoo are destined for the British Museum, a partner in the new project. Angela Evans of the museum staff not only works on site, but escorts every find into museum custody, where another investigation promptly begins. Just as important as digging something up is knowing what it is, what it's made of, how it's made, where it came from. All this is the work of the curator and the conservator.
So how's it going then?
Well, it's coming along quite well, although the silver is quite decayed in places, and as a result the leaf or foil is only loosely adhering around the edge.
Mm-hmm. Is there any of the silver surface left, or is it only the gilding that's really holding the shape now?
Oh yes, the silver's there still, but it's almost completely mineralised. It's almost it retains the shape, but it's no longer metallic silver.
No. And what's that stuff in the middle of the beak? Is that some kind of deposit, or?
Well, that's a bit of a mystery really, because it seems to be stained green, and one normally would expect that to derive from a copper alloy bronze object that was perhaps lying nearby. But it could be some sort of organic inlay that's also taken the staining, that's become stained from a copper alloy object.
That's really very nice, isn't it? Yeah. This curious piece of silver is the latest addition to the Mound 2 repertoire. The objects may be small and smashed, but research in a museum like this, which houses the finest collection of medieval objects in the world, can soon track down their origin and date. The gilt bronze disc from Mound 2, found in 1986, exactly matches the one found by Basil Brown in 1938. Both possibly come from a shield. We can identify other finds from Mound 2. A glass jar, originally like this one, left just a handful of fragments. This scrap of animal ornament from a triangular mount, found in our sieving, probably comes from around the neck of a drinking bottle, like these from Mound 1. And even a tiny gold stud like this is a lone survivor from a very prestigious object. And our new piece of silver? At first I thought it must be a piece of a bird's beak, a bird like that on the Sutton Hoo shield. On reflection, of course, this isn't a simple bird's beak, but a complete bird's head. And if we turn it over, we can see that it's double-sided. And the only object that I can think it might have come from is, in fact, a drinking horn, rather like the one that came out of the ship burial in 1939.
These dispatches from the laboratory confirm that Mound 2 once contained a man, and a rich one, probably as rich as Redwald. Who was he, and how was he buried? The mound is gone, and we are into the central pit beneath it at last. Here is the moment of truth, the nodal point of the funeral rites. I am aware of the earlier excavator, Basil Brown, looking over my shoulder. I wonder how many mistakes we've made between us. He thought he had found a ship burial, but the boat was an odd one, shaped like a dinghy with a square end and buried in a pit. We had never felt happy with this, and our own reconnaissance of 1984 had come up with something else, a ship-like profile of dark earth. Was there a ship stain, a ghost ship, hidden somewhere here?
It's a very odd contour on this side. This is the equivalent of the stuff you took off over there, 1037. It was incredibly soft. Did it go hard on that side when you took it off?
It was pretty soft.
When you thought you had a ship contour, it was always soft, wasn't it? This is definitely something we left on, hoping it might be ship trench. But it seems very disturbed. And no rivets.
And no rivets, so no ship in situ here. These puzzles, these minutiae, are vital because on them depend the story of what was done here, and on that story, our whole view of a remote people. This is the crucial stage. If anyone is going to mess it up, it had better be me. What was it then that Basil Brown had seen? Where had the Anglo-Saxons put the body? Where the boat? 3 days and many layers later, some of the hidden structure is coming into focus. I found the dark lines of the earlier excavation and followed them westwards. To my surprise, they continue underneath a pillar of sand. Basil's so-called dinghy was now square at both ends. Well, if the boat isn't down here at all, it must have been up there.
You have to assume that the boat went over the top,
Yes, I would.
either consciously knowing there was something underneath it, or
Yeah.
purely fortuitously.
But certainly anybody could be forgiven for thinking that was a square-ended boat, couldn't they?
Oh, yeah.
But boat it cannot have been. The real boat must have been a ship, lying at ground level, pressed into this oval hole. While down in the dark void beneath it was something else. But what? Lying on the bottom, the first clues.
Iron and iron staining. And the black is the wood. And these other stains, don't yet know. Perhaps they'll make sense when we've got the whole thing.
Locate, clean, record. Each patch and anomaly. Don't give way to impatience. And then an extraordinary thought. These patches could be survivals from the original burial itself.
Well, what did you make of these patches?
Swirlies.
Here.
Well, I wasn't sure. There seems to be two things there. There's a big swirl, and then inside it, there's a yellower area.
And do you think that could be made by a tub bound with arm having been pulled out by the robbers?
Depends who's sticking to the floor.
Well, depends if we've got the floor. I mean, I think we've got a few inches to go, actually.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the way the black is cut in,
Mm.
and the contrast between, let's say, there and the end, which is nice clean sand, there must be 2 or 3 inches of fill still in this grave.
So that was it. A rectangle of wood surrounded the grave group. And this was how the confusion had arisen. The new structure lurked millimetres behind that first boat-like shape described by Basil Brown nearly 50 years before.
Well, this is the central pit beneath Mound 2, which has puzzled us for so long, dug in the Dark Ages and much visited since. First looters come in from the west, coming and cutting steps as they come down into the bottom of the chamber. They grab what they can and then disappear with it forever. Next, the antiquary. Basil Brown cuts his neat trench in from the east, and then he too makes steps down into the chamber. He finds there fragments of the things that the looters didn't recover. He also found rivets, and recognizing they were from a ship, supposed that that was its square end, and the other end here was its sharp end, the prow, mistaking, I believe, one of the cut steps of the looters for that prow. And lastly, ourselves, the 20th century analysts, trying to piece together the whole story. We clear away the debris left by the others, and underneath we find a chamber grave. A stout square post in each of the corners, and then long pieces of timber represented by these brown lines. And in the centre, the grave layout is still just visible, the imprint left by probably a bucket. And there beyond it, the swirling mass of perhaps a chain. So this jagged hole in the ground is almost a history of archaeology in itself. Looters, antiquaries, and analysts, all with the same destination, that very special place where the earliest English, in their own way, celebrated the mystery of life and death.
2 weeks later, the main season and nearly the whole project ended in one of the most famous storms of the century. Damage was bad, but happily no one was hurt. Work was soon resumed on the latest addition to the bizarre mortuary architecture of Sutton Hoo. The wood pieces are reduced to stains, but the stains are strong. They come from thick planks set on end, either vertically or leaning in like a tent. This is a chamber grave, an underground room where an affluent Anglo-Saxon lord was laid in state. And above ground, within the mound and around it, were scattered 500 iron rivets, because this was a chamber grave with a difference. It had been covered by a ship. These lumps of rust and iron are so often all that is left of the early ships of Northern Europe. And how can we guess what they might mean here? Once again, Sutton Hoo offered a surprise, a ritual scarcely seen before, a ship on top of a chamber. We need analogies, and analogies for ship burials mean Scandinavia. Ole Krumlin Pedersen is currently working on the large Danish cemetery at Bornholm, where all manner of burial rites involving ships have been found. He also has 20 years of knowledge of Sutton Hoo itself.
That's what we really came to see.
And this is Basil Brown's trench, you see, the outline.
He came in that way.
He came in that way from the east. Well, we think there was a boat there. On the top, we've got the rivet plan. You see, these spots are where all the rivets were found, the ship rivets, and they make this extraordinary explosion. The question really is, do you think it was a boat?
Well, it doesn't look like the nail pattern you get if you have the boat lying in its original position. It's like an explosion. You brought out the nails to both sides, and as I understand, you have hardly any of the nails found in their original position.
Well, no, that's quite true. I mean, Basil Brown thought he'd seen some right at the bottom, but they'd be in a place where it would be impossible to have a boat. I mean, they're right at the very, very bottom of the chamber grave. And you're quite right, no, we haven't found a single one.
About 500 rivets, there may be one or two.
You'd think
in original position.
Yes.
And this, together with this pattern, would indicate to me that the boat had been removed before it had rotted away. If this was a robber's trench, why should it be carried right through from one side to the other?
That too, yes.
I think there would have been good reasons for taking the boat out and destroying it. I think this explanation would make sense. If the boat had a special meaning and the boat should be demolished if it was a symbol of something evil.
So what you're saying is that this ship and the mound were not just a monument, but they had religious power, and therefore it was worth the trouble, quite soon after the burial, to take the ship away and smash it up.
The pattern here seems to me to indicate that great care was taken to destroy the symbol and to restore the mound as a proper monument, but without the heathen symbol sticking out.
So, these rivets signal more than a vanished means of transport. Mounds with ships mean sacred places, places scattered along the coasts of Scandinavia, like churches now. And almost like a church is the Viking ship hall in Oslo. It's a national shrine, where now the very best of their burial ships are collected and displayed.
This is one of the most famous ships in the world, the Oseberg ship, one in which Queen Åsa of Vestfold was reputedly buried. It was excavated in 1904 from an enormous mound of blue clay by the archaeologist Gabriel Gustafsson. Inside were 13 horses, dogs with their collars and leads, sledges, an enormous double bed, and the remains of 2 women. The clay had hermetically sealed the timber of the vessel, allowing each detail to be miraculously preserved. It's astonishing to think of a great timber boat like this being placed in the ground as part of a funerary ritual.
Next to the sacrifice ship were the sacrifices of 12 horses, while the bodies of the 2 women, disturbed, perhaps desecrated, lay originally inside a wooden structure, one now familiar to the visitor from Sutton Hoo.
This is a burial chamber. This one came from one of the preserved Viking ships. It's a pretty robust construction, built of timbers like railway sleepers and strong enough to cage a rhino. At Sutton Hoo, the traces of timber that have been found there came from a chamber just like that.
So Scandinavian discoveries put flesh on the bare bones of the much earlier English ships. Was this a royal barge or a warship? Did it cross the North Sea? Could it sail?
The Sutton Hoo ship burial was a thrilling discovery, and so many ideas and so many questions seem to have sprung from that moment in 1939 when Basil Brown began to pick out the form of the Sutton Hoo ship in the sand. But equally thrilling and equally important for us is the study of the early medieval mound builders, the state formers in England and Sweden and Denmark and in Norway. That study brings us close to a whole culture, to a society in the making. But there's a third stage of research yet, to imitate, to experiment with the way that people lived and worked and used the earth. To replicate a ship, for example, is not simply to see how she looked on the water. It's to feel her performance, her foibles, to feel the way that she could make discoveries and make contacts. It's to journey into the hearts and minds of people themselves. And that, in the end, is what archaeology is all about.
This superb replica of the 9th century Oseberg ship was built here in Norway and named the Edda. Each piece of equipment is a copy of that found in the Oseberg burial, or follows a contemporary description. The horsehair stays, the hemp halyard, the curved snake's head prow, the carved interlacing animals, all faithfully copied. Apart from me, the crew are from Norway and Denmark and include some of the world's most experienced sailors in replica ships. For above all, this was a sailing experiment. Finding out about working with a square sail, with no jib and no keel. But it's also the maiden voyage of an enigmatic vessel. Was Queen Orsa's ship an ocean-going voyager? Or a royal yacht? Or the ersatz symbol of a powerful woman in a world of men? The ship's performance will point to the answer. And from this type of knowledge, we hope to reach back further into the dark world of the maritime Anglo-Saxons. But these are trials, and trials are unpredictable. How many sad scenes of this kind must be lost in unrecorded history? What are the last thoughts of a Viking gradually losing all feeling in the glacial meltwaters a mile from land? If repeatable, they no doubt dwell on sail and helm, and that unique moment when the world turned upside down and put him into the deep.
Okay, well, we learned something about experimental archaeology today. Can be bloody dangerous. There we were, sailing along actually at incredible speed on the Edda, and then it just seemed to begin to go, and in fact we knew, 30 seconds before it was going to go over that it was going to go over. It was just a question of getting onto the windward side of the boat and then watching it fall into the water, sail first. And then it slowly started to slip away as the ballast took effect, grabbed onto an oar, well, we came out, and we learnt a lot.
Like there is more to sailing than having a sail. It was technique as much as technology that put the Vikings ahead. This fjord must be full of their mistakes, ships sailing just a little too close to the wind. This was a brush with the most obscure past, its skills and feelings. It would take me 50 years in a library to recreate those 50 minutes of 9th century sailing. I wouldn't have believed a wooden ship could sink so easily, or sit on the bottom with its sails set. But that's how Edda came back, When the Vikings raided the shores of England, the Sutton Hoo ship was long gone. For 2 centuries, English lords had been rowed in Suffolk estuaries. Did they too venture out to sea, often to die there? Some, at any rate, were buried here.
Well, right from the start, we wondered whether Sutton Hoo might be a great communal cemetery. But I think now that even cautious interpretation must suggest that this is a separated burial ground for the elite and their children. They were rich people. Were they estate owners? Certainly. Were they kings? Possibly. Possibly the ancestors and descendants of King Redwold of East Anglia himself. Well, now, we found that some of the richer graves have already been disturbed. But why? Was this avarice, people coming in to take the gold and take it away and melt it down? Or was this the work of earlier archaeologists who were trying to understand what these mounds might mean? Or alternatively, perhaps these disturbances took place very soon after the burials themselves, and we're dealing here with motives that are rooted in the uncharted territory of magic and religion. Something to do with the transition from paganism to Christianity, for example. Well, now, the answers to some of these questions should come from the excavation of the next 2 burial mounds. We already know that one contains a man and one contains a woman. They too probably have been disturbed. We hope for boats, we hope for some grave goods, but what we really hope for is their story. Their secret, which they still keep, is their story, and the story is our real reward.
There's a chance to go back to the beginning of Professor Carver's explorations, as the first 3 programmes about Sutton Hoo will be shown next week on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday in the afternoons on 2 after the 3 o'clock news. And just about to start on BBC One, the 9 o'clock news with Martin Lewis.